Welcome to a new edition of The Big Picture, the show where we try to go beyond the news and understand the larger forces that are driving news events. The Indian economy has been in slowdown. GDP growth slowed down to 5% in the first quarter of this fiscal. The government has taken several corrective measures in recent weeks, including a pretty radical move to cut corporate taxes. To discuss the roots of the slowdown, the sense in government and the measures that they have taken recently, specific sectors, particularly agriculture, employment, manufacturing, and the state of play of the Indian economy, I'm joined by a very distinguished guest. Shamika Ravi, Director of Research at Brookings, India, and she's a visiting professor at the Indian School of Business. Shamika is closely engaged with policy making, but is also an independent outside voice. Thank you so much, Shamika, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Let me begin by asking you whether we are in the middle of an economic crisis or an economic slowdown, and if it is either, what is it that lie at the roots of it?
Well, Prashant, first of all, it is a slowdown. We all recognize that it is a slowdown. But to call it a crisis would be very irresponsible. It is not a crisis. We are far from a crisis. Now, the root cause, frankly, many things have contributed to the slowdown. And this is where, as economists, we tend to break them down into short-term, sentiment-wise slowdown, which is what we call typically cyclical, or you have a structural slowdown, which have to do with fundamental framework of the economy. Now, from a growth perspective, you should think of cyclical slowdown as you being below the potential of the growth. But structural is what could be raising the potential of the economy as a whole. So, those are two very different factors, and they have both got to be addressed in the current climate. I think as far as the cyclical components are concerned, I think the finance minister has made an incredible attempt over the last month or so to make several announcements, policy reforms. Some I think are far-reaching long-term structural reforms like the reduction in the corporate tax, for instance, but also just simplifying the GST, shortening the period of the GST refunds. All of these really add up to make up for this short-term decline in the sentiment. But remember that we had an election after the period which was taken into account to estimate the slowdown or the growth. GDP before elections genuinely, we know this is an expected trend that people wait and watch. So before an election, you do see a sort of pause. And to that effect, I think that is the short run part of it. The long-term structural part of it have to do with, we have had very serious reforms in NDA 1, for instance, enormous infrastructure funding, the telecom, very many far-reaching reforms. Now, we have come to the end of what economic gains can be made from some of these reforms. So now it is time to go back to the drawing board and think afresh in terms of disinvestment. Remember, under NDA 1, we actually had a cabinet-ranked ministry which looked at disinvestment, and that just tells you how important.
The NDA 1 of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, not the NDA 1 of Modi.
Correct.
For the 99 period.
Yes. And to that effect, now it's been almost 2 decades. It's time to go back and look at some of those things. Those are the structural reforms, and they of course include looking at the labor laws, the land reform itself. Judicial reforms. Actually, it's a pity we don't talk enough of what is the nature of contract enforcement in this country. For instance, in a place like Bihar, it takes on an average 15 years to clear a land case. It's not surprising that investments in a state like Bihar is therefore very muted, despite all these national economic reforms that we are seeing. So it's a combination of long-term and short-term.
Do you think that the government woke up a little late to the slowdown? We saw the government after the elections present a budget in July. The GDP figures came out after that. Corporate sentiment dipped a little bit. The markets were not doing well. And then we saw these slew of corrective measures. Yeah. And there has been criticism that the government has actually come up with 3 budgets after the budget.
Right.
And these are actually decisions that are taken through budget and parliamentary scrutiny.
Right.
Would you think that's justified?
Well, first of all, I'm I'm actually quite happy that economic reforms is now becoming a continuum. It is not this big show, annual sort of slew of announcements we see during the budget. So to that effect, I approve of the fact that the FM is listening. I think the PM is listening to the markets, to the people, and responding. Because it is not very long back, it was just 7 years back, that we had an FM in place who defied his own prime minister and much against the ruling of the Supreme Court actually levied a tax in retrospect. It's very important to understand that at the end of the day, economic reforms is about securing property rights. Investments happen when investors, people at large, realize that their property, private property, is secure. Levying in retrospective tax, I think, was a big blow to that security. And within 2 years, of course, then we had the Supreme Court of India basically scrap all the coal allocations of 18 years prior to 2014. Now, these are not just allocations themselves, right? These have triggered a massive economy around energy sector, the power sector. So, the bank's exposure to power sector therefore increased. You have very many firms which have got built, millions of employment around this coal allocation. Now, it's important to realize that India went from being a power deficit country to becoming a power surplus country. So, it's important to realize that when these kind of pronouncements happen, which go towards policy, what does it do to property rights and people's innate sense of security as far as economic rights are concerned? So one after the other, these were a big blow to individual and private property in the country, and that sort of dampened the private entrepreneurial spirit, I think. And that is why since 2012, private investments have only been declining. Many reforms were brought about by, I think, Modi 1, primarily the IBC, the GST, which took decades to bring people together, but negotiate, I mean, a lot of policy making is about negotiating, is about management. It isn't about novelty of the ideas or how cool the ideas are. It's about getting people together on certain agreements. So GST was an enormous, reform in that sense. Then, of course, demonetization happened, which was meant to be a fight against cash economy and the culture of cash. Now, subsequently, we've had a lot of anecdotal evidence come out on the demonetization. Many people have said many things, but frankly, we need a careful empirical analysis also to look at what did it do to inflation. After all, inflation in this country, which used to be very high, and particularly, it affected the poor more. Inflation since 2016 has only fallen and stayed low for a long time. So, you need a more wholesome, you need a general equilibrium sense of what some of these policies have done to the economy. And that brought us to now, the election. Election time is always filled with uncertainty. People wait and watch before they make big announcements or decisions. So the first budget that Nirmala Sitharaman presented was in a very, it's almost like in a hurry, because she presented it within weeks of being given that portfolio. And to be fair to her, many of the announcements which were perceived to be problematic were very quickly reversed, Prashant. And as someone who advises policymakers, it's a relief to me that there were no ego play, that here you have politicians who actually have interest of the economy at heart and they're willing to make these amends.
Your sense was that they were responsive to the feedback?
Extremely responsive, and which is a very welcome sign because policy making is being, about being pragmatic. A lot of economic policy making is really managing expectations of the market and working on the sentiments of the shareholders.
Let me just take you up on that point. There is a lot of speculation on the nature of decision making in this government, whether it is the finance ministry which is actually driving policy. This is a centralized power structure in a way. So is it the Prime Minister's office which is calling the shots? What's your sense of how decisions are being taken in government?
Well, I think they are being primarily driven from the finance ministry. I have to be very honest here. I think contrary to the common perception in the media that Prime Minister Modi is authoritarian and he basically micromanages. On the contrary, I mean, absolute contrary, I would say that almost all these big decisions that have been taken in the last few weeks have been from the finance ministry, and I'd say, from the finance minister herself.
That's I think quite insightful, because that's, as you said, is not usually believed. You mentioned low inflation as one of the points about the legacy of the NDA one, Modi one. Let me take you to agriculture from there. Low inflation has of course been an achievement which the Prime Minister speaks about, including in his Houston rally recently.
Right.
But it has also been accompanied with a dip in farmer incomes.
Right.
Are the two related, and is there a trade-off there? And has this government decided that low inflation is a priority, even if it results in low farm incomes?
Prashant, it's important to understand that every country goes through this economic transition when the population moves out of agriculture or farming into non-farming activities. Now in India, and very peculiar to us, after agriculture, it is basically the services sector which has really taken off. Our manufacturing remains a work in progress. Agriculture has limits to its productivity. That is just the innate nature of agriculture, that while manufacturing or services can have very high productivity gains because of technology and all, agriculture has a certain ceiling to how much you can potentially grow, which means in the long term, gains in agriculture cannot exceed a certain limit. Now in most countries, economic growth has also meant most people have moved out of agriculture. So it has been a small group of people whose incomes therefore can be supported through government and redistribution. In India, that base remains still
Quite
very
large,
right? We're close to 45% now, still in agriculture. Now, given the innate nature of agriculture, I think we have to accept that this is a very large group. The growth story is as much of farmers as the rest of the country. So they have to be part of the growth story, which is why I think so much emphasis on rural economy, rural infrastructure, then the various kinds of financial instruments like crop insurance. Now, I think what will happen over time is, in the long term, we have to bet on the fact that the doubling of farmer income that we are trying to attempt have to basically mean that we have to get a lot of people out of farming into non-farming activities. That is the whole skilling and jobs story. That is number one. But number two, getting technology, getting processing. Agriculture has to now go beyond just cultivation and basically the primary nature of it into much more value addition. And I think that is where the focus is right now, that we have to fundamentally raise the value within agriculture.
The transition that you're speaking about, when this government came to power, this seemed to be a conceptual driver, and that's why Make in India was a big thing.
Right.
But Make in India has not picked up to the extent that many would have hoped.
Right.
Do you think India has missed the manufacturing bus?
Prashant, I get asked that question quite often, and it's important to realize that there is no bus. OECD countries' consumption has led to basically export-driven growth of South Korea, China, increasingly Vietnam. But as Asia develops, as Africa develops, consumption for, or demand for basic manufacturing goods like apparels, footwear, many of these low-end, electronics, etc., that is only going to increase. So there will be many more buses. First thing to remember is that, is there an alternative to a manufacturing sector in India?
Growth.
And I will say no, there isn't one. We cannot say India is a peculiar, our own growth story that we will
Jump
do
from
the
agriculture
services.
to services.
I don't think no country has done it for a good reason. Because so many people cannot be moved out of unskilled agriculture into super skilled services. We have to improve the ease of doing business further. I think the country is progressing a great deal. It is being driven right from top. That is why we are watching these indices so closely of what the world thinks of us, the World Bank, etc. But a lot of ease of doing business is about local conditions, is about state governments, is about specific metropolitan governments, right, local bodies. Because eventually ease of doing business has to do with what is the regulatory burden at the local level, how many compliances do you need, financing kya hai, how do you wrap up, so what is the judicial, the contract enforcement part of it. All those things remain a work in progress, but there is a great deal of effort on, and I think this corporate tax reduction is another step to that effect, right? Because not only is it going to make internally the regulatory burden lesser, India also becomes competitive in the international space. So we are hoping that many of the firms that are relocating because of the trade war will also come here now.
But they have been moving to Vietnam
They have been
mostly.
moving because Vietnam has been a much more competitive market up till now.
And our goal has to be to improve our
Ease of doing
attractiveness.
business. Absolutely. Now think about it. Bangladesh exports twice the amount of apparel we do. Thailand gets 3 times foreign tourists as we do. And those are small economies, right? And these are also trends of past few years. It is not a historical, right?
Trend.
So we can definitely do that, but it's not going to be central government alone. And it is definitely not going to be finance ministry. Financing is a small part of the story. Tourism ministry, the textile ministry, and the states have to play ball and have to take part in this.
One of the areas that you have worked on extensively in the past few years is employment, or rather unemployment. There is a sense that India is at record high levels of unemployment. Is that true? Do we have a crisis, or are we not sure?
We do not have a crisis, unlike many other emerging markets. It's important to understand that there are various factors to this unemployment story. Number one, I think when you talk of all India average statistics, it's very again misleading, because when you have a 6% unemployment rate, underlying that are states like Gujarat and Karnataka, which have 1% or 1.4%, and then you have a state like Kerala, which has almost 13%. So it's important to understand that local conditions are driving unemployment, number one. Number two, it's wealth creation which is leading to job creation, Prashant, and we must never forget that eventually it will be growth that will lead to the creation of a lot of these jobs, as the disaggregated statistics is telling us. Secondly, there is a phenomenon called graduate unemployment, which China and India are particularly susceptible to, meaning millions of young people with a degree, a graduate degree, but they are not working. Some of it has to do with expectations that they're all waiting for a job which is befitting of the degree. Unfortunately, that the skill that they possess is not valued by the market. Okay, so there's a mismatch between degree and skill, number one. Number two, it's an expectation plus skill story. So we have to manage that. China has it, we have it. I think all large population economies will tend to have it. The second is our educated are much more likely to be unemployed than the illiterate. So there is definitely a waiting for a good job which is underway. I think what is perhaps more worrying in the unemployment is the labor force participation itself. India has one of the lowest labor force participation rate, meaning people of the working age who are either working or looking for a job. Our number is 50%, meaning 50% of the population in the working age is neither looking nor working. So where are they? What are they doing? Right? A place like Vietnam has 74% labor force participation. Bangladesh has 56% labor force participation. It's not okay for a young economy to have such a large labor force participation problem. So I think we have to work on that as well, along with, of course, better jobs.
Thank you so much, Shamika. That was a very insightful, thought-provoking conversation. Please join us for the next edition of The Big Picture next week. Thank you.
Thank you.